Today we talked about an introduction, or last class I should say, we talked about an introduction to intercultural communication. I tried to explain to you some of the nuances of that whole concept, the complexities of it, and yet do it in a way that was clear enough and simple enough you could understand the difficulties we face, the problems that this involves. Having done that in our last class session, now today I would like to get on to some of the specific types of logic that are foundational and from which we work. Now, when I talk about 3 or 4 different models that I'm going to talk about today, I want to make it clear that it's not like this one's over here and it's always by itself and it's always used by people, and this one's over here and this one's used by these people all the time and they never get into it. All 3 of them will be, the primary ones I talk about, will be used by everybody maybe at one time or another. However, every culture has a preference, what they typically tend to use and most commonly would be found as they interact with one another on a verbal level. That is dumbfounding for the average American. They just can't picture somebody that thinks differently than what we think, and yet I've tried to point out again and again, we all think a little bit differently. And so those little differences in thought, those nuances of thought here, are just simply magnified 1,000 times over when we cross cultural boundaries, especially as those cultural boundaries become further and further apart. And so with that in mind, I'd like to speak about different types of logic. The first type of logic that I'm going to talk about today is one we often call dispersion logic. It's a type of a logic where we do not make any real effort to relate what we just talked about with what we're talking about now with what we may be talking about in the next 5 or 10 minutes. We talk about what's important at that moment in that scenario, at that particular place and time and in our lives. You say, well, nobody really talks like that. We all go from one thing to another. Think about it for a minute. When you read the Bible and you get back into the Old Testament especially, what do you find there? Any of those things you talk about, any of those books, the prophets especially, in 1 Kings, 2 Kings, Chronicles and all that, if you notice, you find them jumping around a lot. They'll be talking about this king and he does this, and then pretty soon he's talking about the same king that may have done something else and all that, and you think, well, that just happened one right after the other. But if you read a little bit, or if you go, say, from 1 Kings to 1 Chronicles or something, you realize, wait a minute, over here it's very different. I'll give you one specific concrete example. Go to the book of Samuel. And there we have King Saul, and he's by this time starting to mess things up pretty good, and things are starting to fall apart, and this guy named David appears on the scene. Now, if you start reading about David and his interaction with King Saul, you're going to find out pretty quickly they're not using linear logic. In fact, the very first time in my life that I found myself maybe doubting my Christian faith and wondering, is this really true or not, was because I didn't understand different types of logic. I'd read a book by some guy that was a liberal attacking Christianity, and as I read this book, he comes to the story of David, and he's talking about this story in David, and he goes to 1 Samuel and starts out, and there's King Saul, and he's troubled, and he's going crazy there, and he says, go find somebody that can play the harp and calm me down. And so they look all around and they find David. They bring David down there, and David, it says, enters into the service of Saul, and he begins playing his harp and all that kind of stuff and all that. Well, then you just jump forward a little bit the next chapter, and you find the David and Goliath story. Now, what's going on there? Well, you got these 3 brothers who are in the army, and Dad sends young David down with some food for him. Back in those days, they didn't get very good provisions, if any at all, and so the family's provided for them. And so the family sends David down with some of these provisions and says, hey, bring back something from our brothers, let me know how they're doing. Okay, so David comes down there, and there's this Goliath guy over there. And Goliath comes out every day, and he's mocking the children of Israel. And he's this big old huge giant guy with his fancy armor and all that kind of stuff. And he said, you guys are a bunch of dogs there. You're a bunch of cowards. You're a bunch of whatever and all that. And says, tell you what, you guys pick one of the people over there, your very best that you've got, and send him out to fight me. And if he beats me, we'll become your slaves. And if we beat you, you got to become our slaves. How's that for a deal? They looked at this Goliath guy and he said, man, no way, Jose. And it says they ran. They took off. They weren't about to take on this guy. And this went on for a long time, like a month, 40 days, I think it says, something like that. And so this goes on. Well, then David shows up with these provisions, and Goliath comes out and says, hey, this. And soldiers saying, man, if anybody's tough enough to take this guy on, the king's going to give him one of his daughters in marriage. Can you imagine that? Wow, but hey, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to go out there and get killed. David sits there and says, what did he say? Going to give a daughter in marriage. Well, that'd be a big shot in the kingdom then, okay. Then he gets to thinking, and he says, well, I don't like this. Here's this guy mocking God. He's making fun of not only Israel, but of Israel's God, of Jehovah. And I can't put up with that. So he goes to King Saul, and he says, hey, I'll take this guy on. The guy says, you're just a kid. How can you do that? Well, here's my armor. Well, I couldn't do a big old armor for big old Saul, and this little scrawny, probably teenager at that time, shows up. And, of course, it's hanging all over him, and I can't do this, and he casts it off. And he does what he does best. Takes a couple of rocks from the brook. Now, we think of little pebbles, like what we'd use with slingshot, but these things are probably more, maybe something beside golf ball to tennis ball size, something in that area. And he picks up these 3 or these 5 smooth rocks or whatever, and he puts them in a shepherd's bag. Then he walks up to this Goliath guy, and he says, hey, man, I'll take you on. You come out here. We'll go at it. And this big old Goliath looks down, and he says, well, you little snivelly kid, you there, you don't have anything. You think you're going to fight me? You're tough stuff. And David said, yeah, come over here and let's find out. Well, Goliath starts forward. And David, instead of running like all the other guys had done, he runs up to the line of battle. And he gets up there and he takes out one of these stones out of his shepherd's pouch. Now, he worked with a sling. That wasn't like our slingshots. That was 2 strips of leather, probably about maybe 3 feet long, something like that. Pouch on the end. You'd put them in and you twirl them around. You get that thing twirling around, and those things are spinning at probably over 100 miles an hour. And you get a certain point, if you're good at that, you let go of the one string, and that opens up that pouch, and that rock goes flying out there. Okay? A rock is traveling pretty high speed. It weighs 2 or 3 pounds maybe. It's golf ball to tennis ball size. And it's flying at this guy's face at maybe 100 miles an hour. Of course, it hits him and it caves in his forehead, and Goliath falls on his face dead or dying. And David runs up, pulls out Goliath's own sword, chops off his head, and says, you guys afraid of this guy? God gave me the victory. Well, then after this happens, Saul says, who is this kid? Find out what family he comes from and all that. Well, it just said he was in his service the chapter before. Well, this atheist said, obviously, Bible's false. They just tell stories and doesn't make any sense, because if David had been in his service, Saul knew who he was for sure, and he didn't. So obviously the first story is true, or the second story is not true. It made me doubt. It did, honestly. That was my first time. I said, maybe the Bible isn't true. Can we really believe what's going on here? Well, then time went by and I got over that. A little bit later, I started thinking about some of these things and realizing they didn't use linear logic. They didn't worry about that. They weren't chronological in their thought process. They didn't care about when something happened. They cared about what had happened. Now, you say, we'd never do anything like that. That just doesn't make sense. It's too confusing. But do we? You ever known somebody in your family that's a storyteller? Most of us have somebody in our family that was a storyteller. My dad was a great storyteller. And what's a storyteller do? They're sitting around and pretty soon they think of something and they tell you the story. And it's great. It mattered at that moment to them or to the situation or whatever, and so they told the story. Well, a little bit later they were sitting there thinking, and another story pops in their head and they tell that story. Does this story have anything to do with that one? Probably not. Are they chronological? Maybe, maybe not. They're just simply stories they tell. And as they pop into their head, they talk about them because it means something at that moment. In that particular situation, in that particular scenario, something's happened that maybe brought that thought or that idea or that story to the guy's head, and he tells the story, he or she. And so, in that case, what's he using? He's using dispersion logic. Doesn't care if this happened before or after the other. He doesn't care if they're related or not. This thing had something to do with what was going on right then, something that provoked his thought process, and he starts telling about it. The same thing had happened a little bit before, or might happen another hour or two down the road, or the next time you have a family gathering. So yes, we do use dispersion logic at times. It's just not predominant in our culture. All right, now with that, we go into the next one. I got to move along here because I'm taking too long on each one. Circular logic. What's circular logic? Well, that's not linear. You don't start with an introduction, point 1, 2, 3, and then conclusion. Circular logic, you start with an idea. And then what you do is this idea is here, and you might go way out here somewhere, and you start heading in the general direction of that idea, but you don't go right towards it. You don't go in a linear fashion. You kind of go up and around and back down here and on. You keep drawing your circle tighter and tighter and tighter as you get around it until you, boom, nail the point. That's circular logic. Now that makes sense in a lot of places of the world. They would say, no, if you're going to tell me where you're going to go, what's the point of going there? Just shut up and be done with it. So if I'm not going to tell you where I'm going to go, you can't shut the door in my face. You can't escape the logic that I'm going to use and the reasoning I'm going to traverse to get there. And so in circular logic, what you do is you start closing all of the fire escapes around the room and all the doors. Now you get all the doors shut up so that there's no way to get out. You draw it in tighter and boom, that's when you nail it. Circular logic actually makes quite a bit of sense. And if you start looking back at the model I'm using here in this course, and you start seeing what I talk about one day, then what the next day and all, you might say, this guy's all over the place. He doesn't know what he's doing. Well, maybe that's true, but actually it's planned. What I'm doing is I'm giving you a little bit of information here, a little bit of information there, some information here, and then I get to the point where I start tying it all together, and it starts fitting like a piece of a puzzle. So that's circular logic, and it works quite well. It is, by the way, the predominant logic in most of the world. Very few places use linear logic, actually. Only the ones that were directly related to Greek Aristotelian logic, do you find that very much. Most places it is not common. And so this circular logic with a little bit of the dispersion logic thrown in is the typical way that people talk, reason, argue points and things in most of the world. And yet we Americans are not skilled at that. We've not been trained at it. We're not familiar with it. We don't know how to use it. We get somewhere else, we use our linear logic. We say, this is our point. We're going to go over there. And they just say, okay, all I'm going to do is step off the side and you go right by me. You're not going to convince me. You're not going to win any arguments with me because I just simply stepped out of the way of that arrow you were going to shoot at me. And they do. And so that's the reason Americans have been notable failures in sharing the gospel around the world. Now, we've done some good around the world. We've had some great successes, true. But in an awful lot of places, you see guys go out, they work their whole lives and almost nothing to show for it. Why? Because we try to use American logic in a circular logic culture. And it does not work. And so this circular logic is something you're going to have to become familiar with. You're going to have to start learning how to use it. And if you do not, you will fail, almost certainly. Now, circular logic is interesting. It's fascinating. And how do you learn to use it? Pay attention to how they argue first. Pay attention to how they discuss things. And after you've done that for a little while and get to the point you say, oh, I can start to see where they're going. I can start to see what they're doing. Tell a few stories in there. Just throw them in. Don't worry about where they fit in the thing. Just put them out there as an object lesson. You ever notice how Christ taught? What about the parables? Are they in sequential order? Are they logical? No. They're dispersion and they're circular in the way he reasons, the way he deals with people. Jesus did it. Worked for him. It'll probably work for us as well if we try it. We can learn from the examples in the Bible also. Now, I want to finish this up by going on to linear logic, why we use it, how we use it, and all that. Linear logic does have a good place in our repertoire, in our toolkit that I've been talking about. I don't want to convince you, hey, we got to throw this out and forget about it. It's dumb, doesn't work anywhere else, so why do it? Well, certainly in areas of life, that's what's needed. If we are dealing with a complex project that we're going to put into a book and we're going to finish it all up and everything, circular logic doesn't work very well in written form. It's typical in oral cultures. It is not so typical once the culture becomes heavily dependent upon writing and on written records. Now you'll say, wait a minute, you just gave us an example of the Bible. Sure I did. But at that point, what they were doing was recording the oral arguments and messages that were being given as they were being given. And so that's the reason they're in a book, sure. And they were used, of course, Jesus quoted them, Paul quoted them, all that throughout the Bible. But they were not originally written in that form and with that intention. If you're going to do a dissertation, you're going to get your doctorate there, and you got to do a dissertation. You show up with circular logic. See how far you get with your committee. You have to come up with a clear idea of where you're going, of what you're trying to find, the goal that you have. Then once you got that clarified, then you start building the mechanism to get there. And that'll be step by step by step. It's linear. It has to be. In types of research, sure, linear logic is absolutely necessary. It's very beneficial. It's very worthwhile. It's very helpful. And see, what we're doing is we're reading in the Greek thought, in the Greek culture, how the philosophers dealt with life issues and how they worked from a problem to a conclusion. And so we're not seeing everyday life back in the times of Alexander the Great. We're seeing these philosophers because that was what was left to us after the Greek culture crumbled and was destroyed. And yet these great classics were kept, they were preserved, and so we can read them, we can see them. That way of reasoning, at least within the written form, was preserved. Now, by the time we get to the New Testament, things start to change. You read the books of Paul. You go into one of the letters, the epistles. And what do you see there? They're kind of dispersion. They're just, he talks about this event that happens. He talks about that conflict. These two ladies got in a fight over here or whatever. And he's going from incident to incident to incident. And he deals with those and works good. That's a letter. Now, he gets to the book of Romans. What's the book of Romans? It was an argument for what Paul wanted to do. Now, it's written kind of in the form of a personal letter, but it still has a purpose of arguing a point. And so, yeah, he has some what we call rabbit trails. And he was talking about this, but he throws in a story here. He talks about something else and he throws in a story. And so he goes that route. You get up to the book of Hebrews. I believe with all my heart that Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. I think all the evidence points to that. This class doesn't deal with that, so I'll let it go at that. Somebody else says not, that's okay. You can listen to them, whatever. But I think Paul wrote the book of Hebrews. Now, people say, but wait, it isn't like the book of Romans. Of course it's not, because it wasn't the same thing as the book of Romans. And what he was doing in Hebrews, he was writing his PhD dissertation. He was writing this carefully argued point of getting the people to Israel to realize that Jesus was the Messiah. Now, why is Jesus the Messiah? Well, because he's better at everything than what the Jewish culture had provided up to that moment. Take the high priest, for example. He's a much better high priest. He doesn't have a beginning and an end like Melchizedek. He doesn't have to offer sacrifice for his own sins. He doesn't have to do it over and over again. He is the high priest, but the consummate high priest, not the shadow of one. That's why he's better. And so there in the Bible we can find dispersion logic. We can find circular logic. And we can find linear logic. All three are used in different scenarios, in different situations, because as Paul says, we become all things to all men that we might by any means win a few. That's what we have to do. That's kind of the culmination of our toolbox model that I've been giving you. See how I try and pull things together? Okay, now that will conclude, and we'll get into some of the details of how this functions in our next class. Have a good day. God bless.